and others are wrong, which I don't see as any different to the binary proposition of religious fanatics or, sanctimonious moralists who think that they're somehow more progressive or more enlightened than everybody else. All of us are doing the best we can in a network of ignorance. We are always, like it or not, we are always playing some kind of role. I think it's fundamentally about a release of tension. Laughter and crying serve similar functions. They are the breaking of a tension. The tension is almost always a fear. It is the breaking of a fear.
Hi, this is Sifu Slim, author of The Aging Athlete. In this book, you're going to get to hear about two different groups of former high-performance athletes. One group, which is made up of 90% of the former athletes, does not do physical activity on a regular basis and tends to suffer the consequences of a sedentary lifestyle. The other group, which is made up of 10% of the former athletes, is doing physical activity on a regular basis and tends to thrive through the aging process, or at least has a better chance at coping with the aging process. We could have taken these folks to a lab and done all kinds of tests on them. Instead, we slowed them down and sat them down and asked them, in their own words, to describe why they're wired the way they are, so that we all, former athletes and non-athletes, can use some of their inspirational and motivational and mindset lessons in our own lives. I hope you pick up a copy today. You can go to theagingathlete.com. And when you have a chance to read it, I'd love to hear back from you to find out what your thoughts are on the stories of these aging athletes.
Well, my interests, my focus, as we were just sort of mentioning on that document, I'm really interested in, what performers know. We know a lot. I stopped working as a performer in the arts about 3 years ago. I had a heart attack and a burnout. Before that, I was working at an intense level, at a very, very deep level of psychophysical sort of research and exploration across dance, theatre, improvisation, all of that stuff. And the things that, I encountered in 30 years of research are now at the heart of Self with Others, which is a sort of a framework for thriving in an interconnected world. It's at the heart of my work as a coach and a mentor and all of that stuff. Those links are really clear. And there's always a conversation to have there. I know some of your work is around wellness and health. Self with Others also is used around the world by therapists and health practitioners as a framework for their work. So there's all sorts of links we can go through if it's of interest.
Okay, so I don't know if you can see goosebumps on the camera here, but I just got goosebumps when you mentioned a few things, and this vein of wisdom kind of came down in a vortex from the universe and opened up inside of me, something that I've been receiving for my entire life, and it's been getting stronger all the while, each year, and it has to do with the excessive lifestyle and being a man that has some gray hairs right now, or turning white, almost not that many grays left, turning white, the ones that are hanging on for dear life.
I hear you.
The question is why, and where did this come from, this excessive lifestyle? Now, if you'd like to talk about what you saw in terms of your trajectory from age 10 or whenever you got into the performance world, many of us children in the 60s when I was growing up, we all wanted to be hams. We all wanted to perform and dance and be silly and be the best in all our artwork and our songs and play around. And we picked on each other, which was unfortunate, like chickens do to me, it's such a waste of time that animals and humans pick on each other so much, and instead of helping the other person on their path. But the survival instinct is so strong in so many species, and even in bacteria and protozoa, etc. But the maybe you could tell us about that. And first, I'll introduce myself, Sifu Slim. I'm a coach and an author on issues of human performance. I have a podcast called The Real Show with Sifu Slim, and it's currently featured on YouTube. So that's my bio. Maybe John, you could share your bio, and then we could tap into that lifestyle that you've had and when it became excessive in terms of the demands on your mind, body, spirit, and your time.
Well, my background is I became an actor, having completed a master's degree in theatre in the mid 80s. I finished my master's. And very rapidly moved from sort of a straight immersion in acting through to something much more, deep. I'm not saying better, just deeper. I was never very interested in the surface level of acting. I'm particularly interested in the integration of body and mind, how we think affects how we move, and how we move affects how we think. That transcended acting and moved into me working with dancers, martial artists, circus performers. Over years, that transcended the arts altogether and moved into me working with community activists, in the corporate world, with health and therapeutic professionals, and at times in and out of spiritual domains. I don't claim to have any spiritual focus to my work, but it intersects with spiritual work, focuses and so on. And nowadays, working primarily as a coach, a consultant, a writer, and a thinker. I do a lot of thinking, and then various people come and say, how can we use your thinking in our domain? And so I collaborate with people to contribute to the growth of their own particular domains of work.
So, fascinating background. All of this performance translates into life, and I just sent you a video on life as a performance, life as an acting job, because there's a diplomacy, there's a protocol, there's the being of good cheer. Very seldomly when someone asks us how we're doing, do we respond with the 3-minute soliloquy on just how much we're struggling, and how much someone who just called us is ready to jump off a bridge, or is their lungs are about to collapse on their ventilator, And so we try to keep a good cheer. We're diplomatic. We try to be good listeners. Or if we're not a humble human, we just dominate people and we run over them, like America's recent former president, Donald Trump. He has a bulldozer personality, and it's not uncommon out there in the world of people who run organizations and people who run theater groups and dance troupes. And you probably met these, so maybe you have some comments on some of that.
Absolutely. It's interesting you talk about trying to be of good cheer. There's quite a culturally specific thing there in some ways. I think Americans are especially good at being of good cheer. There's many other cultures who, when you say, how are you, people go, oh, I'm struggling a little bit. Or, go, life, what do you expect, So, but I think there's a fundamental sort of truth beneath what you're saying, which is that we are always, like it or not, we are always playing some kind of role. Consciously or unconsciously, we are always in a role. Even in relationship to our own thoughts, we are not constant. When I am a slightly different version of me when I'm thinking about the fact that a software company that will remain nameless really messed me around for an hour or two this morning. I'm a slightly different version of me than the me who's talking to my partner, or talking to, when my mother was alive, talking to her. We're different. When I'm thinking about things, I'm different when I'm thinking about one thing than when I'm thinking about another thing. My argument would be, or the basis of my work, which is Self with Others, is that the self only can exist through relationship. The only time I am not in relationship to something, even if that's a relationship to my own thoughts, the only time I'm not in relationship to something is when I'm in non-dream sleep or I'm unconscious, at which point the self actually disappears. I have no sense of self. Self is always relational. So in that sense, self is always the playing of a role. And in that sense, it maps directly onto what an actor does. How do you adopt authentically a role to communicate to a third party?
Okay, so I'm going to jump right in with something that I saw last night that was partially filmed in Ireland, and it's the movie Barry Lyndon by Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah, I've never seen it. I've always meant to. It's decades old now, isn't it? It's whoever the performer. I can't remember who the main performer is in it.
Ryan O'Neal.
That's right.
Marissa Berenson, Patrick McGee. Do you know Patrick McGee?
Yeah.
Leonard Rossiter.
Leonard Rossiter, who's a great comedian.
And Hardy Kruger.
Uh-huh.
And I watched the making of. I've never seen the movie. And thankfully, we have algorithms on Google and they know what things that I may watch. And it landed on my YouTube options. And I've always been a fan of Dr. Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick. I think it's, what would I call it? It's one of the masterpieces of all time. I really think it is. And we talk about humor as a way to reach people. And I worked in schools, many of which were challenging. And the best way I could connect with these students was by acting, by dancing, and using comedy and silliness, and sometimes seriousness. So it has an undertone of that's not me, so that's the comedy in it. And it was really special. Now you fast forward to the early 1960s, and we have this Cold War going on through the Soviet Union and the Americans, and the Americans have all of their people on their side, and the Soviets forced many of these other countries to be on their side. I'm not sure how many of the citizens of the Soviet bloc were in favor of Khrushchev and the threats that he made, but I'm sure he had many cronies in these Soviet bloc countries that had to say yes to him, and they got benefits monetarily and land and women and other things by saying yes to him. But Kubrick was sitting around with a gentleman who's English, and you may know him, and they were trying to figure out. They optioned this book. It might have been called The Red Scare or some. There was a book they optioned about the detonation of atomic bombs, and might have even been detonation of hydrogen bombs. I can't remember. And they kept thinking of what they were going to do with this book and how to get the message out that there's this huge problem in the Cold War that we could blow up the world basically. And it got to be early in the morning by the time they were trying all their different types of drama and standard ideas. And they got to be goofy and silly at 2 in the morning or 5 in the morning. And they had to take bathroom breaks and this and that. And they said, you know what? What if the news that there was a threat and that there's this commander from America send his B-52s, or I'm not sure what the bombing planes were with the atomic weapons on them, over the Soviet Union. And what if the news happened when somebody was in the bathroom? Then you've got a comedy, and you could have a dark comedy to go along with it. And they started laughing, and then they came up with all these ideas of these crazy characters, and Dr. Strangelove with Peter Sellers is based on a variety of characters, including this general whose name is Curtis LeMay, who bombed Japan into the dark ages before the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they said, that's it. And then they got all these great character actors to do it. And then they made the set over in England at this wonderful studio that you're aware of. But the making of Dr. Strangelove, I encourage people to watch, and the making of Barry Lyndon is fascinating. I'll let you jump in before I talk about the making of Barry Lyndon.
Well, it's an interesting, the idea that you explore the inexpressible, or that which can't really be spoken of straight. You explore it through comedy or through archetype or through mythology or whatever. It's the driving force behind art, right back, all the way back, as far back as we can trace art and performance. It has been about looking for languages to communicate the inexpressible in ways that the people you are directly talking to can accept and absorb and understand. So, you're talking to people who understand the ways of horses and the weather. You tell stories about horses and the weather. You're talking to people who understand movies or, contemporary hip hop. You work through movies and contemporary hip hop. Artists have always been fundamentally contemporary and also universal. And performers are always playing a specific character or doing concrete things if they're dancers. I mean, dance is concrete. It's actual moves happening live in front of a camera or in front of an audience. There's nothing made up about it. But at the same time, the performer is being universal. When you see a comedian, you just don't want to just go, that's funny. You go, I recognize a bit of myself in there, or I recognize a bit of somebody else from my community in there, or that's just like my dad, or, you find something universal, and yet it's very specific. So we got this really interesting thing that Dr. Strangelove, for example, is a absolutely grotesque, extreme character. Yet it is a vehicle to talk about something that we recognize in our daily lives. So this link between the very specific and contemporary and the totally universal is at the heart of what all performance is. And again, I would argue that it's what we do in our lives. We are always being who we are, but also we are always somehow trying to be bigger than we are, not in a corrupt way. We're trying to be, I think people are naturally trying to be good, naturally not just trying to be a dad to someone, but be a good dad, be the sort of dad their kids will remember, will tell their other kids about and say, my dad's great. We're always aspiring to this sense of somehow transcending our own lives. And that can be a good thing because it leads to amazing things. It can be an awful thing because it leads to egomaniacs trying to dominate the world.
What do we do biochemically and physiologically with laughter? Does it somehow open up our heart when we can't control ourselves? Physiologically and emotionally, does it open up our heart? Does it remove enough stress in reality that it's natural for the heart to open up?
I think it's fundamentally about a release of tension. Laughter and crying serve similar functions. They are the breaking of a tension. The tension is almost always a fear. It is the breaking of a fear. What are our fundamental fears? Our fundamental fears are death, not belonging, of which being shamed is part of not belonging, of disconnection, which is part of not belonging, and of self-loathing, of being ashamed or not even belonging to ourselves. Laughter is when we connect, it releases the tension of being somehow isolated in your own experience because you laugh with other people. I think that's why, I don't know if you ever had the experience of laughing somewhere where you shouldn't be laughing. And that is so painful because your whole system is going, connect, connect, connect. And another part of your system is saying, shut up. You're shaming yourself. So laughter, to use your phrase, opens our hearts because it actually opens a channel to connection with often another human, but not necessarily. It can be a connection with ourselves. It can be a connection with the world around us. I live in a very beautiful place these days, and I walk out, and sometimes I just look at the sea, and if I don't laugh, then at least I smile, and I'm connecting with the world. When I walk out on a summer's night and hear a blackbird singing in the hedges by the roads here, I smile. Sometimes I talk back to it. Sometimes I laugh. Sometimes I join in its song with a whistle. We're always looking for connection, and laughter and often tears are a validation of and an opening to connectedness with others.
Wonderful stuff. There's so many things that you've mentioned in the last 15 minutes that I think are deserving of 20-minute to 30-minute conversations with examples. And one of my first somewhat famous athletes I interviewed for my study on athletes after their high performance careers were over, and including anyone with a physical job: actors, dancers, general contractors, plumbers, ex-military, high school, college, and pro sports athletes, martial artists, etc. And this gentleman, who is featured in my book, The Aging Athlete, he had gone through a period of difficulty in his life where he became his own worst enemy and his family's own worst enemy for a period of time. He had a breakdown. And then he had to take medication after that for different things that became part of his biochemistry of his brain that he didn't know about before the breakdown, but then he found out that it was more severe than he thought. And so he needed to trust me before he spent some time with me on Skype and a recording. This is before we did these Zoom to YouTube videos. And I said, look, it's going to be like two young guys talking in a treehouse. And that's what it is. Whatever pops in, we want to talk about, we're going to talk about it. We're going to honor it. We're going to show integrity. And what you don't want to share to the world, we won't put it out there. I want you to trust me on that. There's nothing I'm gaining here by minimizing something that's important to you. And then he thought of the movie Stand By Me, American movie from the 80s, with those kids who go out and wander around and they run into some trouble and they run into some bullies who are older than they are. They all stuck together, but they had this experience of, growth, human development, coming of age. And he said, if that's what you want to do, then I'm all for it. So then he's the longest interview I've ever done. 5 hours and 20 minutes on Skype. And we went through a good part of his life and his father's life. And we really got to some things that were helpful to him. And that was my Sifu guru side coming out. It takes patience, and it takes the right questions. It takes the right listening, soundboard skills. And we got somewhere. And oftentimes with high performance people, it takes slowing them down. And this conversation allows you and me to slow down. And that's where you gain in understanding, you gain in human development, you gain in heart open conversations and mind open conversations. And I think one of the things that I critique the modern era is that we don't do this enough. And we don't do it enough with settings that are basic settings: nature, a living room, a back porch, a front porch, really basic settings. When I've talked to people with whom I wanted to get together over the last 25 years, often it's been, let's go out and get something to eat. Let's go out and have a beer. And I said, well, there's some connection there, but it's not like the 60s and 70s where you didn't require a meal. You didn't require a bar, a restaurant to go do that, or a cafe. You could do it anywhere. And your walks in the country, I mean, I would love to participate in a walk in your countryside. And I'm looking at the beams and the woodwork and the stonework and the bricks in your home. It looks like a fun place to have a conversation, and have you break out something that you read 30 years ago or a picture from when you were 12 and say, this is something I did with a family member, my dad would have you. And then we go into that for half an hour, and I get to tap into a beautiful experience or a learning experience or a challenging experience that you had that you're now reliving for the benefit of our together moment.
There's so many things in there that I think are important. The first, most obvious response is yes. To move forward, do less. I mean, the only time we have any agency, the ability to achieve anything, is in this moment now. We can plan the future, we can mull over the past, but now is the moment of action, even if that action is just sitting and thinking. If you are constantly driving forward and filling now with stuff, you never have time to pay attention to the details of the actions you are taking now. And any action that's worth taking is worth spending a little bit of time paying attention to. But we rush through now towards some mythical future which never arrives, and everything we do has the quality of inattention to it because we didn't pay attention to it. And we can move that on and think about, I often talk about there being two fundamentally different modes of learning. And by learning, I don't just mean in an education situation, I just mean learning about life and, doing what we do as we go through life, which is acquiring experiences and knowledge and so on. One way of learning is to discover new things, to acquire new skills. The other way of learning is to notice what we are doing that gets in the way of being able to do what we could do anyway. Connecting, hearing, listening, being part of the natural world, being in relationship with another. These are all things we are born with. They're our birthright. And a crucial way of learning is to stop trying to acquire more and notice what we are doing to prevent ourselves using what we already have. One is the acquisition of skills. The other is the removal of blockage. So I think that's really true. And the other thing that, if you were to be here and we were to sit and go for a walk and, I've got 3,000 books downstairs, I love being at somebody's house and say, excuse me for 10 minutes if I don't talk to you, I'm just going to peruse your bookshelf. It's fascinating. We have the opportunity for information to turn into understanding or knowledge. And we then have the opportunity for understanding and knowledge to turn into wisdom. And you don't acquire wisdom by constantly learning new facts. You acquire wisdom by taking time to synthesize and dig into the knowledge and the information and the experiences that you've recently acquired, and you put them into relationship with older experiences, and that way you achieve wisdom. So it's not that slowing down is somehow lazy or whatever. Slowing down, taking time, getting a lot of sleep so that your hippocampus can clear out and reassign recent information into sort of neural networks with older information, thus creating wisdom and understanding, giving yourself time to do dreaming, which allows you to process information without the emotional resonances which get in the way of you understanding that information. All of this stuff that we are born with, we need to learn to use it instead of constantly going, yeah, but I'm just going to acquire another fact, get another certificate, get another job, earn some more money. All of that stuff is a distraction from actually achieving a rich life in the only moment we have, which is the present moment. And I'm not saying we don't plan, and I'm not saying we don't have intentions and purposes and objectives and, set up pensions and all of this stuff. Of course we do all of this stuff. But life is now. And wisdom, real depth, real human achievement comes by being able to be in profound relationship with now. And that takes time.
Part of what you just shared, John, is the argument that I call more is more versus more does not equal more. And I've seen this just in an interview last week with a tennis player who's a bit older than I am, who's now a coach, and he's got quite a following. And he said when he was in his teens and 20s and even 30s, the coaches in the 60s through early 80s were saying, if you're not getting the results that you want, you're not beating the people who are, the winners of these tournaments, you've got to do more fitness, more training in this area, more training in that area, more reading, more studying. And that really wasn't the answer. And some of the people who had those better skills or winning the tournaments, they did less. They just had the groove. They had the physics down. They had the mindset down. They had the technique down, the fitness balance down. You don't have to do more fitness all the time. It has to be the best you can do that's not breaking down your system and keeps you able to play like in the French Open or US Open. It's 2 weeks. So how are you going to get through those 2 weeks if your mitochondria, your telomeres, and all these microscopic parts of your body, and then your larger things like your tissue and your joints, if they're all fatigued or are rebuilding and they need time to rest, you have to do everything in the right balance in order to get through those 2 weeks. And
but it's interesting that, isn't it? Because maybe one of the key wisdoms that we can acquire, and certainly if, like I am and like you are, part of the role you've decided to play in life is to be of service to others and to guide others, is to be able to observe yourself and know when you need more and when you need less. And if I may, there's a old Buddhist story. I don't claim in any moment to be a Buddhist, but they have amazingly good teaching stories. And there's a wonderful old Buddhist story I often tell people when I'm training them. Then, the students go to a teacher and say, you're full of crap. You don't know what you're talking about. And the teacher always has a beard like I do. So he strokes his beard and says, interesting. Why do you say that? And the students say, because you say one thing to one person, you say work harder, you say something else to the other person, no, work so hard, and no. You just say whatever you need to do to get us off your back, and then you can just go and sit around on your cushion or whatever. You're lazy and you're dishonest. And the teacher says, okay, let's just look at it like this. We're walking on a path through a mountain. And on one side of the path, there's a steep drop. And on the other side of the path, there's a steep drop. And we're walking on this path, and I'm walking it too, but I'm a couple of steps ahead of you. And I'm looking back at you, and I go, you, pupil 1, go right a little bit. Pupil 2, go left a little bit. Pupil 3, keep going exactly as you are. Pupil 1, no, go left a little bit. I know I said go right, now go left. I'm trying to keep you on the path. And this, of course, all these stories are not about teachers and pupils, but about one's relationship with oneself. Knowing, am I being lazy? Do I need to work harder? Or am I over-efforting? Do I need to stop? Am I overthinking and I should just go for a walk on the beach? Or am I simply under-analyzing and not being bothered to do the work? In which case, sit down at my desk, get a bit of paper and do some analytical thinking. It's being able to observe oneself and know when you need to acquire more and when you need to do less so that you can synthesize and dig a little deeper into what you already have. And I think that self-observation is perhaps the greatest learning skill any of us ever acquire. Well, if I've ever acquired it, it's a lifelong ongoing process of self-observation. It's never a journey you complete.
You mentioned Buddhism, and yesterday I sent an email to someone who's a Zen priest, and he studied Buddhism for many years, and he's in the National Basketball Association. He's been a coach and an assistant coach and administrator. And I mentioned Robert Thurman, who's the actress Uma Thurman's father. He's 81. He's in New York City, and he's known as a Buddhist author and academic. And he's one of the world experts on Tibetan Buddhism. Now, I've been pursuing many things in my life. One of them is intellectual advancement. And fortunately, I was born with a caring personality and a curious person. I wanted to know how things work. And I wanted to know what authors who were writing these books actually thought, what they were living through, their social history of the time period in which they lived. And that's fascinating to me, how they lived their life and what was going on in the geography where they lived and any other geographies that they happened to know about through, if you went to the Middle Ages, through trade. They could hear news from, ships coming in and meet with people. And that's what the elites often did, is they would bring in people who were traveling and have them stay for a meal or several days so they can learn what was going on in a faraway place. Maybe their enemy's castle. They would also want to learn about what they were planning against the person who's now inviting the person in. So this gentleman, Robert Thurman, when I first heard him, was probably the late 90s. And, I already done a master's degree by this point, and I'm reading a lot, I'm listening, I'm going to lectures, working on my own books, and realizing how much I had to learn because, I didn't know how to put it all together. And then I heard this guy, Robert Thurman, and I said, oh my gosh, boy, did he raise the bar high. He can talk, I forget what they call it, impromptu speaking. There's another word I'm looking for. It's like ad ignatio. There's one of those Latin words.
And ad infinitum, to
ad infinitum,
extemporize.
Yeah, extemporaneous ad infinitum, and he could just go for weeks with new stuff that comes from the Vedic texts and the other texts that he knows so well. And he was someone who basically renounced money to a certain degree. I'm sure he kept enough to live, but he married a very affluent woman, and they both decided to live in a more what's the word when you live simply? There's another great word that I can't find right now.
Aesthetically.
Aesthetically,
Yeah.
aesthetically.
I can never differentiate between aesthetic and what I mean.
He's an aesthete, or
yeah.
A lot of fun things we have to learn with Latin, and we didn't have enough years of Latin. We didn't have enough years of the Renaissance. There's so many things you never have enough time for. But when you watch Robert Thurman, or at least when I do, I said, boy, this guy has good intentions. Boy, he knows his stuff, and boy, he cares. And if you talk geopolitics, like from a Henry Kissinger, who, in my opinion, is a guy who lived in fear, who grew up as a Jewish person in Germany until he was 8 or something, and then came to America. So he comes from this very warlike time and escaping Germany, and then he gets to America, and he's an intelligent person, and he gets in there, and he's an advisor to heads of state in America, and he gets famous. And he leaves his wife when he, in his 30s, when he became it's almost like a sex symbol of intelligence during the post-Nixon years in the 70s. He became like a Hollywood elite, as an intellectual and someone who was high up and placed under Nixon. And you see a lot of people see him as this intelligent being. My thought is and I probably did back in the 80s also. When I listened to Robert Thurman in the 90s, I realized no, Robert Thurman has his intentions and his cleanliness and pureness is so powerful, and his knowledge, of course, is so powerful that when you compare him to someone like Kissinger, who's from the knowledge equals wealth, control, and domination,
Mm.
it sweeps someone like Henry Kissinger out off the trail of something that matters very quickly. And the only reason I think that Henry Kissinger matters is because someone with power and with weapons and with the ability to character assassinate you could back him, whereas Robert Thurman's backed by sages and DNA from the most intelligent, well-meaning people and energy, the source of the energy from the history of time immemorial. And
It's very,
so,
it's very interesting, isn't it? The difference between a genuine intellectual whose interest is generally benign. It's in the continual development of knowledge and in the sharing of that knowledge and conversation with others and so on. And what one might consider the useful fool of the power elite, which is someone who is certainly smart and articulate, but whose interest is the justification of power, not the pursuit of knowledge. And I think there's a contemporary example of that. I've been on a mini campaign which will have made no difference to anyone whatsoever to try to persuade us to stop treating Jordan Peterson as an intellectual. He's not an intellectual, as in any terms that I have of understanding. I mean, he's smart, definitely. I don't think he's brilliantly smart, but he's smart. He's articulate enough. But like Kissinger, he will talk a certain intellectual language and open up some intellectual domains and debates. And then when push comes to shove, when you get to the nub of a question, he will leave aside the intellectual argument and instead simply pursue the ideological argument. So he will say, evolution says this and evolution says that. And you go, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll go with you here. Yeah, I'll go with you there. And then you'll get to, one of his things, which is around the fact that he thinks that men are oppressed. And suddenly you're ignoring a whole load of facts there. And you're not stupid. You're ignoring them, but you're more interested in winning the argument and proving your point than you are in debate. A true intellectual is, like a great scientist, is the one who goes, come on, prove me wrong, please. If you prove me wrong, if you say something I can't answer, that's amazing. I'm going to have to go away and rethink. And that's the intellectual's sort of aim.
So as an ideologue that he is, are you, when he writes a book or when he says 2 paragraphs worth of information based on fact and data from the psychological research community, and he disagrees with someone's point and he uses that and then he stops, is his point of view that fact and the analysis and that observation around that fact something that in and of itself that you disagree with, or is it what he does with that information and how he handles that debate beyond that disclosing of 2 paragraphs worth of facts, research, and observations and analysis?
Yeah, it's difficult because it's different in different contexts. There are things that Peterson has said that I've gone, yeah, I think that's fundamentally sound. There's things that he said that I think that's fundamentally sound, but I disagree with. There's things that he said that I think are fundamentally unsound. And there's things that I think he says that I've read that I think are profoundly dishonest because they're being said to achieve an outcome, not for the sake of the truth of what he's saying. So it's different in different contexts. And I think this is my opinion, and I don't claim to have any inside knowledge on it, but my reading of it is that he is more interested in being a brand than an intellectual. So much of what he says is in some way about enhancing the role he wants himself to be playing as a provocateur, as a ideologue of the far right, as a sort of a, well, one of the new misogynists. He's not someone like Andrew Tate, who is an avowed misogynist, but he's a sort of the intellectual foundation on which people like that grow. And I think that's where he makes his money. I think so much of it is about making money. It's not that there is a single response to what I think people like Peterson, or for that matter, Kissinger, are saying. I think my discomfort, and this moves way beyond, Peterson or whatever, into my discomfort with a lot of modern politics and so on, is this claim to truth and rightness. When my skin crawls, and I immediately find myself in opposition to when a politician goes, we have looked at the options and this is the right decision. Because I go, you don't know that. Let's be honest. All any of us are doing is canvassing what we know and making the best guess we can. And an honest person, I think, goes, I think this is the best path. Not the right path, the best path. If more information is revealed to me that I didn't have to work on, I will adapt what I'm doing to suit that information. And if I've made the wrong choice, I will take responsibility. People like, a lot of people who pass for public intellectuals these days are in fact selling a binary proposition that they know and others are wrong, which I don't see as any different to the binary proposition of religious fanatics or, sanctimonious moralists who think that they're somehow more progressive or more enlightened than everybody else. All of us are doing the best we can in a network of ignorance. We make the best guesses we can to serve our needs, our families' needs, our community's needs. How far does your community exist? Mine includes blackbirds and trees and the beach and people dying under buildings in the ruins of Syria at the moment. Other people's communities might be just the people in their street. And I have no right to pass judgment on any of that. And to claim that I am somehow right, I think is just a form of profound arrogance. And I think people like Peterson and Kissinger and many contemporary politicians are arrogant because they think that they can define the world as a binary of which they're on the right side.
Wow, this is really fascinating to me. I have not had a conversation with someone about Jordan Peterson who has read his dialogue and his branding that you mentioned the way that you are, but I'm sure it's out there on the internet. I just haven't landed on it yet. Maybe we could do something where we watch him speak and we play a minute and a half or something and then we pause it and then we hear your reaction to it.
Yeah, we could. I'm a little nervous to engage with it because I have to detach my intense dislike from the political and ideological perspective he comes from, and I have to try to be reasonable and objective. And there's a set of paradoxes in there. I'm protesting against his ideology, but fully aware that I'm looking at him through an ideology. So there was an interesting one I admit I haven't engaged so much with him. I think I get a little frustrated with him because he's everywhere these days, generally complaining about how he's been blacklisted and not allowed to be anywhere these days, yet seeming to be everywhere while being cancelled or whatever it is that he's been. I did watch a full 10-minute piece by him. I can't remember what it was now, about a couple of months ago, because somebody I respect and like very much said this is very good. And yeah, the first 6 minutes were very good. And then I'm afraid yet again, I just went, sorry, you've just evaded a question. You've moved into ideology, not into intellect. The interesting one, and this is a very cheap two-dimensional psychological analysis. I saw an early talk he gave when he was a university lecturer. I think even before he became a professor. And he looks like a very timid and personally insecure person. He's not reaching for any great thing. And what he says is often quite interesting. I think as he has developed the brand of Jordan Peterson, he's become less and less authentic. And I would guess that it's to do with masking a deep personal lack of a sense of his own authenticity. You know, I think an awful lot of people who shout very loudly about how bright and right and, you know, better they are than everyone else are simply trying to drown out the voice that goes, are you really good enough? You know.
Have you watched, there's three parts of Jordan Peterson's content that I spent some time watching over and over. And there are two debates with Sam Harris. And then there's another episode where Sam Harris appears on Jordan Peterson's podcast. So Sam Harris is, since Christopher Hitchens died, you know Hitchens?
Mm-hmm.
Hitchens was, I would guess, you know, I haven't compared Hitchens to the gentleman I just mentioned, the Buddhist, Dr. Robert Thurman.
Mm-hmm.
Hitchens probably the most artistically eloquent, articulate speaker of the English language I've ever heard.
Mm-hmm.
Speech makers, I looked quite a bit into speech makers that are in the English language. Churchill comes to mind. I'm not sure about Lloyd George and some of the other famous Brits from the early and mid part of the 20th century. But in the United States, three people I looked at quite a bit were John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Franklin Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
Now you think, how is Franklin Roosevelt going to compete with the other three? Let me tell you, I'm getting goosebumps again. There they are. After I had become so enamored, and let me see when I was looking into this. I remember where I lived, so let me think of the years. Up until so somewhere between 2001 and 2003, I spent some time. Why, you know, this was the era before YouTube, so I used to get a lot of VHS tapes and watch these great speakers and watch them again, compare them. And when I thought that Malcolm X did such a good job, you know, it's unfortunate that I was trying to rank them, but it's this who's the greatest, the GOAT, GOAT, greatest of all time. And I was looking at Malcolm X as being this phenomenal speaker because he was so calm when he did it. And he had the whole world against him except for his followers. And he was thrown out of the faith of Islam, the Black Muslim faith. And then he was killed shortly thereafter by people in the Black Muslim community. And then I landed on the debate between Roosevelt when he was really declining in health, which was probably from the time that he was in his 20s. He had polio as a kid, so his health was always declining. And so here he is, you know, within 5 to 8 years of dying, and he's in an election campaign. I'm not sure if it was his second or third election. And his speaking ability and his movement of his head and laughter and lightheartedness and the way he puts his head back from time to time. I said, this man is a master actor and a master speaker. with what would you call that? Par excellence. Second to none, you could say, and maybe other people will receive that differently. But this is what I landed on at that time, and I'll let you jump in here and tell me what you think about speaking ability and believability and selling yourself, because a part of public speaking and acting is selling the scene and selling the character.
Well, see, so we were talking about it, agreeing or disagreeing. Someone like Churchill, I think is a massively problematic figure. I mean, ask anyone from West Bengal what they think of Churchill, and they will talk about a genocidal mass murderer. And it's pretty fair. His behavior in India was raw, disgusting, raw genocidal racism. I mean, he referred to the Indian.
What years was he involved in the decisions about India and had that heavy hand?
Mid-30s lead up to the war, I believe. It might have been earlier than that, but I think it was the mid-30s. And basically there was there wasn't particularly a crop failure. There was a lot of food in India, but it was all in bonded warehouses, all guarded by armed guards, and all being shipped out on ships to England while 20 million West Bengalis died. And Churchill's response was
20 million?
Something like 20 million, I think. The figures are off the top of my head. I may be wrong, but it was a mass genocide.
Starvation.
Event, and genocide as in he was literally indifferent to the wiping out of the whole Bengali culture. He said if those beasts didn't have so many children, they wouldn't be suffering this. That's the English attitude. The great talk about, Ireland now, the talk of the Great Famine in the 19th century, there were plenty of potatoes, there was plenty of food. It was all getting shipped out to England. The Irish farmers were dying on their fields, and the food was going out to England. England has a history of committing acts of extraordinary violence in pursuit of colonial ends. So someone like Churchill is a huge problem. But when he speaks, particularly in the time of war, he speaks with, it's not inauthenticity, quite the reverse. He speaks with absolute authenticity. He's playing a role. We're back to where we started this conversation. He is playing a role. He is playing the role of the wartime leader. He is playing the role of the father of the nation. He's playing the role of the person on whose shoulders lies the defense of the world against Nazi Germany. He's playing that role, and he inhabits it like a great actor with absolute authenticity. He's not real. I'm sure he was leaving when he's talked about, our colleagues and friends in India and all of this stuff. I'm sure he was leaving the chambers and saying appalling racist things about his colleagues and friends in India because he was an appalling racist. But while he was saying it, he was inhabiting it with absolute authenticity. This is the skill of an actor. People think acting is about pretending to be what you're not. That's such a naive two-dimensional understanding of real acting. Real acting is playing a role with absolute authenticity. So pretending to be who you're not, but doing so completely authentically. So you authentically inhabit the role that you're playing. It's an enormously complex relationship between reality, pretense, and authenticity. And again, to go back to the conversation we had before, I think that's a fundamental part of our life journey, how we can inhabit our different roles and acknowledge and celebrate that we sell different roles. I'm different talking to you now than I was on the beach 2 hours. And I'm different to how I'll be when I go downstairs in 20 minutes and start cooking dinner for my partner. We're different all the time, but we try to be authentically inhabiting the different roles we adopt. So someone like Roosevelt, who I don't know so well, although I've seen bits of him speaking, and certainly Malcolm X, who I've watched a little bit of and read some of his stuff, they are straight down the line authentic. Another person who is straight down the line authentic, James Baldwin, what a fun, when you see Baldwin talking about his experience of a black man, being a black man in America, my God, he's powerful, but he's also fueled by love and passion and connection. He is so real. And yet there's also anger. At other times, if he's talking particularly to another interviewer who's a person of color, there's a comradeship, there's laughter, there's talking to other artists, he's slightly different, but always this authenticity. And maybe this is, the heart of what we're looking for.
I'm not sure Baldwin's shoes were ever filled in terms of Black people in my country filling that role where they kept advancing the discussion in such an articulate and intellectual way, completely grounded. I don't know if it's happened. We've had some really fine professors. One was friends. He's from Sacramento, and his mother was maybe the first Black school principal in that area, Sacramento, California. And he was friends with Obama or connected to Obama before the election, his first election. And then because Obama didn't do the things that they had talked about, this professor dropped him. And they weren't, I don't know what their connection was after that, probably nothing. But I'll look him up while we're speaking. But what about Baldwin and America's Black community and him dying in the 80s? I think he died in 87, Baldwin. Let me take a quick peek here. He died in 87 at age 63 in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, France. I'm not sure if he was living there, but writer and activist, urban fiction, African American literature, gay literature. There's another thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
A spokesman for gay people.
Yeah,
all
Giovanni's Room is I think it's Giovanni's Room is a beautiful, beautiful gay book. And then it's also a book by a person, by an African American, and all of these things. He is genuinely the public intellectual whose primary expression was through literature. But then you go sideways, and it's not a surprise that also somebody from the still, but particularly back then, oppressed communities of African Americans, you got someone like Louis Armstrong who writes the song "What a Wonderful World," and in all my callow, I think I know it all upbringing, I always thought that Louis Armstrong, he wasn't a proper activist because he's just doing feel-good songs like It's a Wonderful World. And then I had a friend who was back in the 80s when I was studying, who was a Black South African, and that was before the fall of apartheid. He had left and was studying at a university in England. And I was saying, oh, Louis Armstrong, he's just doing songs to, be cheerful and whatever. And he goes, my friend from South Africa went, you got any idea what it's like for a Black man to be on the stage playing to an audience that he's not even allowed to sit in, saying, it's a wonderful world, and whatever you people do to me, I'm still going to hear the birds sing, and I'm still going to say, and I go, my God, that song is a work of a public intellectual whose form of expression is the trumpet and his voice. But it is more than the song. Baldwin's writing is more than the writing. There are people I know, in America now, who I think are serving the roles of public intellectuals. The space for the public intellectual has been narrowed. That's not an accident in our contemporary culture. But all of us, as are you, I'm sure, as am I certainly, are looking for how to play our role, who our audience is, in other words, who we are able to, suited to, and permitted to communicate with, and how we can occupy that role authentically. And again, I want to map that straight back onto the role of the artist, back through to people sitting in caves under the stars, 10, 12,000 years ago. We are looking authentically to inhabit the role of the storyteller, of the dancer, some people of the spiritual, seeker, the medicine man, the medicine woman, whatever. We're looking for our role, and we're looking to inhabit it with genuine authenticity?
I did find the name of the person
Uh-huh.
who was born in 1953 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. His grandfather was a pastor of a church, the Metropolitan Baptist Church in Tulsa. They moved to Sacramento, California, and his father was a general contractor for the U.S. Defense Department, and his mother was a teacher and later principal. And I met his brother at a putting green near where I lived in Sacramento, and we talked for a brief time. But his name is Cornell West,
Ah,
and
yeah,
he's
okay. I've seen bits of him talking. He's a fine speaker, isn't he?
yeah, if I could do a little imitation 20 years after I used to be able to do his imitation. Well, that's interesting, my brother. And he keeps throwing my brother out there. Because you said that, my brother, let me come at you with this thing. Now, friends, and it's a little bit of the gospel pastor
Mm.
and an intellectual, and he's very entertaining. I think he's very well intentioned. I haven't learned on the Wikipedia page. I haven't gone down to and they have a section if you've done any horrible things, well, or even been accused of any horrible things, they'll put that down below. But I do want to read more about him, watch some more of his content. But he's, Harvard and Princeton educated, definitely a high-thinking intellectual. He represents the left wing. He speaks on race, gender, and class in American society. So he's done a good effort of fulfilling that. And then there's another Black scholar who is on the right side of politics. Let me see if I can find him. He's in his 80s now. Also, this Cornell West is 69. This other guy, I think his last name is Sorrell. Black author. Let me see if that's his name. No, I couldn't find him. I'll keep thinking on that. But he's gotten quite a bit of following on YouTube, and I think he's very rationally based, and he doesn't go off onto very highly contentious accusations and these things. He smiles. He says the facts as he knows them. He grew up very poor in Harlem, and he found that the library card was his most, even when he couldn't afford sneakers. I can't imagine. I didn't grow up in a time where I had any problem, with my parents helping me out buy sneakers. But he grew up in a time 20 years before me where the people in Harlem couldn't buy the new pair of sneakers. They had, problems with shoes, just like the people in the 1920s had problems getting shoes that didn't have holes in them and it didn't make their feet hurt. Boy, I can't imagine something like that. But weigh in if you would on some of this, John.
Mm. Well, so you talk about the right and the left of politics. I increasingly, having come from, I suppose, a relatively conventional leftist perspective, and they say that as you get older, you go more right wing. For me, it's not true. As I get older, I actually get more radical. But I no longer quite believe in the notion of the left or the right. I mean, because they seem to me ways to describe political, ways to organize society, which all work within the paradigms of some form of capitalism. It's either capitalism run by private industry or capitalism run by the state. But China as a communist country is not a communist country; it's a state capitalist country, and so on and so forth. So increasingly, I find myself going, we are in too deep a set of interlocking crises to get worried about labels like right or left. I think it was D. Hock, the man who's, do you know D. Hock's work? D. Hock was he was actually the person who was charged in the 50s with setting up the first credit card interchange, which became Visa. He was a financial person. So he basically set up Visa, ran Visa for 15 years, and then walked away from the financial industry altogether bought some wild land up, I think, in Washington State, and immersed himself in deep ecology, really understanding a deep level of ecology. Created something called chaordism, understanding that systems work best through allowing that which is chaotic to be chaotic, that which needs order to be ordered. But there's a story in his book, Towards a Chaotic Universe, where when he was setting up Visa, which they were given incredibly little time to set up. So, the bank said there were credit cards, they were bankrupting the banks, and the bank said, you've got 3 months, set up a way of globally exchanging credit cards between banks or something. And there's a story in his book about someone comes in and says, okay, what's my job title? And he said, you can call yourself Fairy Princess as far as I'm concerned. There's a list of jobs on the wall over there. Do whichever one you feel able to do. Tomorrow, come in, see what jobs need doing, do what needs to be done. If you're feeling great, do a tough job. If you're feeling rough, do a simple job. Just every day, get that marker on the wall moved towards our conclusion. I love that as a way of thinking. It doesn't matter. Think so far outside the box that we don't think about left or right. We are in a situation globally and, as humans, of intersecting crises. It's very easy to say, well, no, we're not. Ask the 65% of species existing on this earth that are within a decade of extinction whether or not we're in a crisis. I think they might have to say something along the lines of, actually, we live here too. It's too late to be thinking of left and right. Now, D. Hock said something really important. He said, things are much too bad and it's far too late for the luxury of pessimism. Now we have to be optimistic. It's too bad. Things are too bad and it's too late to be pessimistic. I also think it's too bad and too late to get hung up on, yeah, but you're a right winger, I don't listen to you, or you're a left winger, I don't listen to you. What is going to stop the environmental situation getting worse? What is going to stop people falling deeper and deeper into mental health crises? What is going to stop our communities shredding themselves by people identifying with one, whatever it is, race, gender, ethnicity, culture, religion, against another? What is going to stop these intersecting crises? And I don't care how someone identifies in terms of right wing, left wing, pro this, pro that. If I've got somebody, who identifies as a right winger, who speaks from a position which I think is reasonable and intelligent and able to be applied outside the people who they naturally serve. There are many people who say, have solutions to things, right wingers who have solutions to things, but you go, those solutions only work for the West or for people who already have money or for whatever. Solutions need to be global, and I don't care where they come from. They can come from religions. I'm not religious. They can come from religions. They can come from ancient traditions. They can come from right-wing economics, left-wing economics. I don't care. We need solutions, and we need to have the humility to hear what other people are suggesting and to genuinely hear what they're suggesting, rather than go, I'm going to make assumptions about what you're going to suggest based on the label that I've chosen to give you.
The name of the individual of whom I was speaking is Thomas Sowell, Sowell. And I think he's worthy of watching some of his videos. I haven't read his books. He's 30 years older than I am. He's born in 1930 in North Carolina. They moved to Harlem when he was young. And he's got quite a history of being, he was at the United States Department of Labor and many universities after that. And he was asked or, forced out of several jobs because he wouldn't compromise his values and his thoughts. They wanted him to say a certain thing, which is what Jordan Peterson says that happened to him at his university. Couldn't say certain things, had to say other things. It's all the same. It's control of speech. And Yeah, and we ask people to like and subscribe. And I have a website, Sifu, S-I-F-U, slim.com.
Mhm.
And, if you have a website, share it. But I'm certainly pleased to have had this time with you today, John.
Good to talk to you, Sifu.